Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm going to be talking to you today on a little bit of a history lesson of my personal view of where I think Agile project management, Agile delivery, Agile whatever you want to call it, where it came from and why I think that's important for people to understand. What I feel whenever I'm looking at Agile, when I'm using it, I try, or really in a lot of things, why I think it's important to know where something's come from, to be able to know why it is the way it is today, and where it might be going into the future. So, let's get started. So, where did Agile really come from? To me, I think it started with a guy called Frederick Taylor back in the mid to late 1800s. Now, Frederick Taylor was known as the first scientific management consultant. Now, really, to us today, for anyone in the industry within consulting, he's just a consultant. That's all he did. He went to factories, he went to businesses, and he told people how to do things better. If you think about modern consulting, he basically did a PowerPoint and said, here, do all these wonderful things and your factory will improve, because no one ever does them. That's what he did, but he was doing that as what was deemed really the first one in time. The key thing that he did was he really looked at all the processes on production and he broke it down into its simplest observable form. So that way he could then take people from the street who weren't specialist workers in guilds at the time and go, follow this simplified form of what I want you to do for your little part of the overall process, and then you'd have lots of people doing those individual parts that all led up to the final puzzle, which was building whatever it might be, like steel rods or screws or sheet metal or whatever it might have been that he was doing. And it caused huge efficiencies and massive reductions in cost, because he was finding general laborers, training them up for a very specialized little piece of the puzzle, getting lots of those pieces of puzzles to make the overall product. And that's what he did, basically, in a nutshell. But if you think about Agile development, he broke down the overall piece into a backlog of items and then slowly developed them so that he created a full production line. That's what he did, but he did it back in the early 1800s. The next one on the list is a guy called Frank Gilmour, who actually was heavily influenced by Taylor. And there's loads of documents that talk about how those two loved each other, hated each other, and then loved each other again, and how they worked together. But most people don't know Frank Gilmour, or have not heard of him, but you will have heard of what he coined up with him and his wife, which is the time and motion study. Now, he is the first person acknowledged with actually coining the term time and motion study, where he was monitoring what people were doing, measuring the time and the motions, and trying to find efficiencies. And where he became famous was where he did this with bricklaying. And he revolutionized how bricklaying worked back in the day to make it highly more efficient, way more bricks being put onto a building site and laid, and buildings being built in a much quicker time with a lot less waste. Again, to us nowadays, time and motion studies, they're normal. We've heard of them numerous times, but he coined the term. And again, what did he do? He looked at a process and went, how can I make this more efficient? Just like Frederick Taylor did, at the same time. How do I look at what's happening, see where it can be improved, remove the waste, and improve it, and continually improve it? And that's what Agile development is about. It's about looking at what the goal is and breaking it down into smaller parts, your backlog, going out in sprints, and from those sprints you start to learn, what does it mean when we've done this, what worked, what didn't work, and trying to continually improve. And these guys really set the tone for that. Frederick Taylor and Frank Gilmour set that tone on how that works. So, next one I want to talk about is a bit of an oddball in terms of where this fits in, but it's a direct influence on what Frank Gilmour and Frederick Taylor were doing. And it's Henry Ford, the guy who created the Ford Motor Company. Now, again, we know there is loads of documents out there to sort of show that Frederick Taylor directly influenced Henry Ford as well. He hired him on numerous occasions to help him with his factory. What Frederick Taylor helped Henry Ford with, and why Henry Ford obviously became famous for the Model T Ford, and you can have any color you want as long as it's black. Really, what he did that was so clever is he broke down the manufacturing process of building motor cars, which was not new. People were building motor cars back in those days, but they were building them almost to order instead of off a mass production line. And what Henry Ford did was he looked at the process of, right, I want to make a car, but I want to make a car that's good enough quality at an affordable price for the average person in the US. And that's what he did. Now, he didn't come out and say, I know how to make an affordable car for the average US consumer that's good enough quality and cheap enough to buy. No, that's what he wanted to do, and then made the production process to fit that purpose and continually improved upon that process to make it faster and cheaper and better. So he took the learnings from Frederick Taylor and from Frank Gilmour to create that. I mean, one of the examples is that he broke down the entire process into 84 discrete steps through time and motion studies on how to build the cars. He looked at meat processing plants and went, well, a cow comes in, it gets slaughtered, and then gets cut into its parts as it goes through the production line, from bigger to smaller to smaller to smaller to smaller. And he went, well, if I flip that and go, well, I get all the parts coming in smaller parts, screws, bolts, nuts, lights, bulbs, sheet metal, and instead of breaking the cow down, I put the cow back together again. It's essentially the car production system. Now, it sounds simple, but back in the day, no one was doing that because everything was made to order. He changed that around by looking at processes of what's worked in other areas and incorporating it and adjusting it and continually improving it to fit his process. So you're hopefully starting to see the basis and the foundations of where I feel agile development came from, and it came from these sort of three guys. Now, obviously, there's loads of others in history that were there, but those are sort of three main characters. Now, when we take the next step and look at, say, the next three people who are more modern day, who we might know, who they sort of worked the 1950s to the 2000s sort of thing. First one is W. Edwards Deming. Now, Deming is renowned for the really rebuilding what was the Japanese manufacturing industry post-World War II. Prior to World War II, Japanese manufacturing, it was basically the same quality as Chinese manufacturing in the 80s and 90s. It was absolute garbage and was renowned around the world for being crap. Post-World War II, and as we now know it today, modern day times, Japanese manufacturing is, got that stamp of approval of quality. If you get Japanese stuff, generally it is of a very, very good quality for not a very huge price. That really all comes down to Deming. What did he do? The biggest thing he did was continuous improvement through using control charts, mathematics, and statistical quality control throughout the entire process of manufacturing. So he instilled that into the Japanese manufacturing industry, that using charts for production across your entire production line and continuously improving and looking to improve quality constantly actually benefits you by reducing your overall cost of production, and can potentially mean that you get better profits at the end of it. And that's exactly what they did. That's why their quality control in Toyota cars was so much better than the US cars, and the pricing was so much cheaper, and how they could be so much quicker to get to market was because they had these processes in place. That all came from Deming. The next one on the list would be Taiichi Ono. And Taiichi Ono is basically the father of the Toyota production system, which inspired lean manufacturing. And lean manufacturing has a lot of similarities to what we see in agile project development. Continuous improvement, constantly looking at removing waste. And that's what Ono did. He had the 7 wastes, or Muda, that he constantly looked at in terms of how do I create optimal ways of removing waste, which is very similar to what Frank Gilmour did with his time and motion studies. How do I remove waste of movement, of time, of processes that don't need to be repeated, or if they do need to be repeated, we repeat them in all one big block, so we don't have time wasted going back and forth doing similar activities but having to set up. It's what Ono did, and that's what made the Toyota production system, which made Toyota car manufacturing become what we now know globally as was one of the best cars in the world. That's what Ono did, and he was influenced by people like Deming and obviously the ones before. And then the next one I feel that set the tone for today, and I'll give an example why I think that as well, is Eli Gold. Now, he was a physicist who got into consulting, and he wrote a book called The Goal. And The Goal, as you can imagine, it talks about the goal of manufacturing, of creating an efficient factory. And he looks at how they broke down the processes. And what he's actually talking about is his theory that he coined up, which is called the theory of constraints, which covers bottlenecks in production and how businesses are only as good as their slowest point. And what that means, and the way I sort of explain it to people, is if you think about a relay race, like a 100-meter relay race with 4 people. If you have Usain Bolt on your team, the first fastest 100-meter sprinter in the world, and you go, right, we'll put him last because he'll bring us back to the point. Well, actually, let's put him first. Let's put Usain Bolt first, because we'll get out the starting lines really quick. We'll be 100 meters done within 9 seconds. No one will be able to beat us because he's the fastest person in the world. And then the next runner we have is my granny, who struggles to get to the table, let alone run a 100-meter sprint at the speed of Usain Bolt. And then we have just normal people, for the third and fourth. Why do we always lose? Does Usain Bolt need to run faster? do the other people need to run faster? Or actually, do we look at the entire team of those 4 people and go, if we had 4 normal people, would we actually be better because they're all running at the same speed and they're all finishing at the same time? Maybe. And this is what he came up with, was actually a factory is only as good as its slowest manufacturing part of the factory. So if you can make the slowest part work a little bit faster and then the next slowest part and keep going that way, you're making each part work to its maximum of what the slowest producer is within the factory, which means you're lowering your waste, so you don't get lots of WIP, work in progress, build up, and raw materials or items sitting there waiting to be manufactured, so you reduce your cost base. And he took the learnings from Ono and Deming and Frederick Taylor and Frank Gilbreth and Henry Ford and took them into a more modern day way of looking at it from a scientific point of how do we continually improve things, that as we improve one thing, it makes something else become apparent that's not working because we've improved one area of the machine, that is the production machine. Now there's going to be another slower part, and then once we fix that, there might be another slower part, or that might influence something else. And it's that continuous improvement of constantly trying to improve what we need, but always with the mindset of the goal. What is the goal that we are trying to achieve, which is efficiency, lower cost of production, higher profits, etc. But instead of looking at individual areas and only looking at the one bit without how it affects everything else, you can fail. And that's what Eliyahu Goldratt talked about. I mean, the goal, some of you may or may not know this, but if you've read the Phoenix Project, the Phoenix Project was directly influenced from the book The Goal. The Phoenix Project talks about DevOps and moving to higher to better systems and computing and using data and AI and algorithms to help you do things better. That was all coined by a guy who wrote a book in 1984 who got that from people like Ono and Deming and Frederick Taylor, who were born in the late 1800s and early 1900s, before computers were even a thing. So to wrap up on what I've just talked about, the key thing for me, whenever I look at a new methodology or a new way of working, I always want to understand, where's this come from? Who's been involved? Where's it been successful? Where's it not been successful? Where is it working now? How is it being used? And how do we think this is going to help us into the future compared to what we've already got? And the thing I always try and look back on is, in order to know where you're going, you need to know where you've come from. But also equally, to be successful in knowing where you're going, you've got to be able to adjust from the learnings from hindsight that you've had in the past, and being able to always look into the future to see what is it I'm actually trying to achieve. And as the future changes and the technology changes, as cultural things change and as people change and as your own experiences change, you need to be able to adapt what it is you're trying to do based on all that knowledge and all that learning and all the things that happen to you and things that you can't even see that are going to happen into the future. So to wrap up, there's a whole bunch of people that have been involved in this. There's a bunch of people I haven't even mentioned, but these 6 people, sort of the 3 core who set the foundations in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to then the sort of 3 more modern day ones who are more the mid 1900s to the late 1900s. I think it's great to understand who these giants are, what they did, how they worked, where they were successful. And I think it's really key to understand that legacy of where Agile has come from, and hopefully it helps us understand where it's going to and how we can use it and where it's being useful. Anyway, I hope you've liked all this. I'm going to be doing some more different things and talking about other stuff. Hey, look, I'm a vlogger, so I'm going to give it a go. Please leave comments. Obviously hit the like button, please. That'd be great. And obviously subscribe if you want to. Cheers.